Hello, everyone, and welcome to uh, Philosophy One with Professor Michael Sigman in the philosophy department at East Los Angeles College. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the overall picture for our last unit of the course, which is social and political philosophy. And I'm going to be going through a handout that I actually made available to you guys on on our class site. But I wanted to clarify a few things and just make sure to emphasize make sure that everybody's on the same page, especially in the latter sections. So let's move forward then. As you saw when you're covering this short handout, um, social and political philosophy, we talked about this way back in the beginning of the semester, is there's a difference between social philosophy on the one hand and political philosophy on the other, but they both have the same exact central question, which is, as we saw on the first slide, what is justice? So, justice, that idea of justice, is the central topic for both political philosophy and social philosophy. Your book gives a nice definition of political philosophy. You can find it on your page 171. And to sort of summarize it, political philosophy is concerned primarily with the role of the state. So here we're talking about um, cases where there are, for example, conflicts of interest between an individual or a group and the state itself, that is to say, the government in some form. So, where did the state come from? I mean, why did we ever agree to uh, these sorts of rules that have to let somebody else tell us, what we can and cannot do? What is our relationship as individuals toward the state? What sort of rights do we have? And also, what is the extent of the authority of the state? And authority, the question of authority is really a very important question for political philosophers. Social philosophy, on the other hand, doesn't look so much at the state, or that is to say, the government, and the sorts of laws that are set in place uh, to govern our everyday behavior. Rather, social philosophy, although it does, of course, broach upon the topic of laws, social philosophy is more concerned with how society operates. It's not about the individual um, with respect to the state or the state with respect to the individual, but this latter category, social philosophy, really is about distributing benefits and burdens in society. So, the idea of justice in the context of social philosophy has to be addressed in order for us to determine things like who is going to get the benefits of society. I mean, social cooperation comes with a great deal of benefits, uh, you know, as basic as things like security, freedom to move about without threat of injury, things like retirement plans like a Social Security plan, which is presently apparently under debate whether we should have one or not in the U.S., which is ludicrous. Nevertheless, who will get the benefits of society, and similarly, who needs to bear the burdens of society? Our society is able to do what it's able to do and produce those kinds of benefits for everyone because we have different individuals who are playing different roles. That is, people are contributing, and you are contributing as well, hopefully, to your society insofar as you do things as simple as pay taxes. When you go to the store, you pay a sales tax right there. You don't really have a choice, so you're contributing whether you like it or not. But we also have income tax and various other taxes, property taxes, and the like. But also, we can think about things like serving in the military, where the interests of the nation are protected by individuals who served roles in the military, and so that job of sort of putting your life on the line for the nation, that is a burden that some people will take upon themselves in order to receive benefits as well. In some societies, in the U.S., it's very unique because we have a voluntary army. In most countries around the world, though, that's not the case. Military service or military conscription is mandatory. Also, how should society go about providing those benefits for its members? So, how should we work together to best achieve benefits? And then once we achieve those benefits, how do we divvy up the pie among the different participants and what they're doing in society? Justice, then, is what we would call a normative term, or sometimes called a prescriptive term. So here you're talking about how things should be, how things ought to be, rather than how things in fact are. In an ideal world, the way that things should be turns out to be equivalent to the way that things are. But I don't know that we have ever or will ever achieve that ideal world. So when we talk about improvements and we say the state ought to make a law against that, for example, things like predatory behaviors on the internet. That when we say something like the state ought to put a law, the government ought to put a law against that type of behavior, we're saying not just that this is the case, we're saying that in fact something ought to be the case. So that's called a normative concept. And so what we find is that both political philosophy and social philosophy, they're both normative fields. And they share this much in common with the field of ethics, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. When you say you ought not to trip little kids, what you're saying is that it's preferable. That's something that maybe we know individuals that do that stuff, but we ought not to do that. Normative decisions, in other words, are value judgments. So we're saying this is more valuable than that. And so in normative fields, the way that we compare models is that we investigate the various strengths and weaknesses that those models have, and we figure out which of those models and which of the principles that they're based on are the most convincing, are the most persuasive or convincing or rational. And we look for things like consistency. Does the principle that this model is founded upon, does it contradict itself? Because if it does so, then it can be shown to be working at cross purposes. So, particularly in normative fields, we will find a certain type of argument that gets used a lot by philosophers in particular, and that argument strategy is called a reductio ad absurdum. And I apologize. I just noticed the typo. It looks like something auto-corrected on me. It's not supposed to be reduction ad absurdum. The N in reduction shouldn't be there. It's called reductio ad absurdum. And it's a Latin expression, which means, it's got a pretty cool name, it means reduced to absurdity. So you're taking your opponent's argument and you are reducing it to absurdity. And you might say, wow, that's pretty cool. How do I go about doing that? Well, the argumentative technique called reductio ad absurdum, and you run into this in things like logic classes. But the general strategy is that you assume that the persons that you're arguing against, you assume that their fundamental principle, you assume that it's true. And then you combine that principle with other principles that we hold to be true, and you show that the result of adding in your opponent's principle creates a contradiction. That is, it creates a position that can't possibly be correct. And so you have, in other words, created an absurdity out of adding your opponent's principle into the mix of generally accepted facts. And again, if you're interested in that sort of strategy, a logic class is a good place to start. There are different areas, as our text points out. When we talk about justice, there are different areas of inquiry. We can talk about, for example, compensatory justice, sometimes called corrective justice. And the goal here is to provide benefits for individuals or groups who have suffered undeservedly. That is, through no fault of their own, they've been sort of shortchanged. And so you're starting to get the sense that this field is actually pretty big, or at least you should be getting that sense. In that we've already mentioned words like rights. We've already mentioned that there are multiple senses of the word justice, or different areas of inquiry into justice as we're putting it here. Also talking about how justice is not a type of field where you say, here's a fact. What you're saying instead is that this principle works better than the other. So you're starting to get the idea that social and political philosophy then is quite diverse. So, returning, we can talk about perfectly well something like compensatory justice. So an example of something like compensatory justice would be a program like the Affirmative Action Program, which says that there are certain groups who have been unfairly excluded from institutions of higher education, for example, and as a result, we are going to provide them with benefits, or provide them with extra assistance because they have suffered undeservedly through no fault of their own in the past. That's different. That's quite different than talking about something like retributive justice. Retribution is really about punishment. So you can see it's a far cry from talking about affirmative action to talking about locking people up. Retributive justice says, what do we do with those who violate the laws that have been established? What is the proper punishment for these individuals? I mean, if someone commits the horrible crime of jaywalking, should they be beheaded? I mean, should we put them up on the guillotine as the old French would do? Probably not. I mean, that seems excessive, right? So you want to develop a system that has the punishment fit the crime, but also, and I mean, this is really a very rife for investigation area, retributive justice, that is, in that there are different models of what the purpose is really for punishment. I mean, are we aiming to rehabilitate people? Is that the point of the criminal justice system? Because if it is, then we're doing a terribly bad job at it. Or is the main purpose something like deterrence? That is, to just take these people off the street and use them as examples so that other people will be deterred from following suit. That is, they'll be inclined not to do so because they've seen what happened to others who did that. Okay, so we've got compensatory justice, we've got retributive justice, but there's also another type of justice called distributive justice. And this is really an important concept for social philosophy. Distributive justice talks about how do we distribute those benefits and burdens of society. And this type of justice, distributive justice, really is the most fundamental of the three that we're talking about here. And it is so because you can't really even talk about who's been wronged or who's violated the norms of society if we don't have those norms in place. So, as I put it here, questions of compensatory justice only arise when the goals of distributive justice are not obtained. And with respect to retributive justice, that's only required when somebody or group has, probably knowingly, acted against the notion of a fair distribution of benefits and burdens in society. Okay. So we turn then to the state and its role. And so we're not talking about the state of California. We're not talking about any particular state in the United States. We're talking about what today typically people call the government. Um, but that's not quite accurate because there are different types of governments. There are different governmental systems, right? So when we refer, what the term state refers to really is a collective entity that is sometimes called a polity or uh, a group that is united for mutual benefit. Really, that's the purpose of it. So that state and its role in our lives is of really a very practical importance. Our text actually gives a really interesting, short, and it kind of seems like flippant definition of the term government that's quite good. I mean, I'm really kind of impressed by how Kessler came up with this. And let me just read it directly. A government is the exercise of power and coercive force by one person or group over the rest in a society. And that's precisely what a government does. That is, it sets uh, rules and enforces those rules. So we start from ground zero, really, in political philosophy, and ask, do we even need something like a government? Do we need to be in these political associations that have governments that tell us what to do? And most people will say, yes, indeed, we do need these things. But there is a certain group out there, they're called anarchists, and anarchists argue that we do not. That we in fact have a moral obligation not to forfeit our moral authority over to another group. Anarchists, and your book, by the way, gives a fantastic definition and description of what real anarchism is about. Unfortunately, today, there are groups that call themselves anarchist groups that really are not. And there are, to put it frankly, anarchism as is more of a sort of a fashion choice for many people than it is a political stance. Because these anarchists, these so-called anarchists, when push come to shove, they want to be protected. They want to be protected by a state. So they're not really anarchists. They just don't like the state that they're under or the government that they are answering to. Anyways, anarchists, they say no. So what is the state's job then? And of course, I just mentioned it previously. That is, it's to set and enforce the laws or the rules of society. And when we're talking about setting these laws and enforcing them and so forth, we have to be careful because sometimes we start to, the tendency is to collapse two different ideas. That is, the idea of legality, the right thing to do in terms of the law, as opposed to morality. So, the way that, what I want to warn you against is don't confuse the two, because morality is a completely different and and actually much broader topic than legality. You can do something that's immoral, that's not illegal. And in some states, it's also possible to do things that are illegal that are many people consider to be not immoral. And that's a very good question, actually, as to the relationship between legality and morality. There are competing theories out there, like natural law theory is a theory that says, in essence, that our laws are designed to reflect morality, whereas another type of theory of law is something called legal positivism. And legal positivism says that really there is no foundation to legality. It doesn't really trace back to morality. It's just a set of rules that we use that function well. Okay, a huge question for, and I hate to use that cliched word, but an enormous topic of discussion for political philosophers is the question of authority. What is it that gives the state the right to tell you what to do? I mean, why is it just a matter of them having more guns? or having more influence or having more money? I mean, is that really what it's all about? What limits should we hold out for? What limits should we place on the state power and say, look, you cannot go there? And we'll see an ardent defender of individual liberty in our, and I'm sure you've read it already, in our first reading by John Stuart Mill in his work called, in fact, On Liberty, which is a seminal work, I mean, just a classic work in defense of the individual's right to freedom. Should we make trades? Should we allow our freedom to be impinged upon in order to live in a more ordered society? We know what anarchists are going to say. Those guys are going to say no. Whether their system will work or not, that's a different question. But what most people will say is that this trade-off, if it's a good bargain, that is, if the benefit outweighs the cost, then it's perfectly reasonable for us to give up some of our freedom in exchange for things like security, for things like protection, for things like a sustainable society where you can seek gainful employment. I mean, these things don't come from nowhere. And so, it seems like a pretty good trade if I'm just trading, my freedom to maybe slap my brother in the head or something. It seems like a very expendable freedom that I would definitely trade for the right to, or for the opportunity to have a career where I can make money. It's a good trade, or at least it seems so. Finally, and here's where I really wanted to clarify some things for you. We want to talk about the notion of how a state treats individuals, because there are always natural inequalities, or at least there always have been, and looking into the future, we never know. But there are natural inequalities. I mean, not everybody looks the same. Not everybody has the same emotional capacities. Not everybody is as beautiful as everyone else. Not everyone else is as intelligent as others. There are just these natural inequalities that occur. People are not exactly the same. So how should the state treat these inequalities? Some people are born into wealth, and some people are born into poverty. How should the state handle them? Well, an answer that's commonly given is that, and especially in the Western model of democracy, we say that the state really needs to engage in fair practices, and those fair practices involve giving to each person what she or he rightfully deserves. Okay, so if somebody works for something, maybe you say, okay, they deserve such and such benefits or breaks. But hang on, that question about deserving something, of the fancier word is desert or merit. The question of desert or merit is itself pretty murky, because there are lots of different standards for what it means to have earned something. It is, in other words, another normative matter. What do people deserve? What sort of treatment do they deserve? That is a judgment call. And one very good example of this, and one that I wanted to clarify for you on the video here, is the distinction that was made by this guy, a philosopher named Ronald Dworkin. Dworkin, who taught at NYU for a long time, Dworkin talked about different conceptions of equality, and one of them he termed equal treatment, and the other he termed treatment as an equal. And on the surface of it, there of course is no difference, right? The terms appear to mean the same thing, but Dworkin stipulated what he meant, which is what good philosophers do. That is, they specify exactly what I mean by this term is blah, blah, blah. So here's what he meant by each of them, and they are different. Equal treatment is a model of justice in which there is one set of rules. That set of rules is made public. Everyone knows what they are, and that set of rules comes with it one set of penalties. So everybody knows this is the law. If you break that law, here's the penalty that you're going to get. It doesn't matter who you are. So equal treatment, to many people's mind, that is what justice is all about. Set the rules and play fairly in the sense that nobody gets special treatment. Now, when we see things like white-collar criminals walk away from destroying people's lives, and we see people with much more minor offenses getting locked up for many, many years, this is the reason that we're outraged. It's because we don't believe that there's one set of rules that applies to everybody. We believe that the government is treating people, particularly those with connections and those with more money, far more leniently. And that, of course, is a source of moral outrage. A big fan of equal treatment as the model, or still are talking about the first model here. A big fan of that, and we'll see that in our reading, was Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as we see, really defines just and unjust laws along these lines. Dworkin, however, argued that there's a better way to think about justice in a society. There's a better way to think about equality. And it actually calls for us to have different penalties that correspond to the different laws. And here's really Dworkin's rationale. If we really want to have an effective society, and we want to have, for example, these laws respected, then violations of those laws need to have an equal impact on the violators, such that they are dissuaded from participating in that type of behavior again. So here's a really simplistic example of that. Let's say that on a given day there are two people right next to the college who break the same exact law, and that law is no parking in a red zone. And please do not do that for public safety, but also the fines, as a matter of fact, are huge for parking in a red zone. So, anyways, so what would the model of equal treatment say to do? Well, these two people, they both parked in the red zone that day, so since they both violated the law, they both deserve the exact same ticket. So they're going to get a ticket for, let's say, $750, which is about what it runs, by the way, if you park in a red zone. So again, watch out. So $750 ticket for both people, and giving that penalty to both people, that's what it means to have a fair society. That's the equal treatment model. What Dworkin argues is that that sounds good, but in practice, there are inequalities in people's lives, and the individual circumstances of the case might necessitate us adjusting the penalties to suit the particulars of the individual's life. So what Dworkin really argues here is that we need to, rather than just sort of robotically saying, these rules are hard and fast, we should have the ability to really to empathize, to put ourselves in another person's shoes. So imagine that those two people, though, we look into their lives a little bit more and we find out that they're radically different individuals. The first person who parked in that red zone that day was the proverbial starving student. So this person was in a panic, wanted to turn in a term paper at the last minute or something, and so made the unwise decision to park in a red zone and ran over to the professor's office, dropped off their paper, went back to the car, and then, oh no, there is a ticket for $750 on the windshield. Okay, that's going to hurt, right? Now, person number two, who violated that same law in the same day, is the proverbial fat cat. This is not a starving student. In fact, this individual has a chauffeur and just told the chauffeur, just park in the red zone, I don't care. I'm going to walk across the street and buy a $1,000 cigar to smoke on the way to my meeting. Obviously, this person is so wealthy that a $750 fine is really not going to be that much of an incentive for them to stop parking in the red zone. Whereas for the starving student, that person, penalizing them $750 for that behavior could be the difference between them being homeless or not, between them eating that month or not, between their children being taken care of or not. So if we want to have a system that really dissuades people, it really deters people from breaking those laws, then we should design the penalties to have an equivalent impact on those individuals. So perhaps like a $300 fine for the starving student would get their attention and make them realize I never want to do that again because I don't want that kind of ticket. But for the fat cat, you're going to have to increase that penalty up to, who knows, maybe 5,000, 10,000, something like that. Because really the point is to make that individual stop engaging in that behavior. So treatment as an equal means serving our citizenry in a way such that they are treated that they are treated equivalently. Okay, very different model, right? Another debate that used to take place a long time ago, and I think it's probably going to resurface pretty quickly here, is the debate between equality of opportunity and equality of result. So again, we were talking about desert, right? That is, how should we treat everybody? We should treat them fairly, but what does it mean to treat them fairly? Is treating them fairly giving everybody the equal shot, the equal opportunity to succeed? Or is our model of society based on equality? Are we going to call it fair only if we get the equal results? That's a big difference. Equality of opportunity and equality of results. Today, in higher education, the movement toward equity is adopting the latter model, which, as I said, it's, I think, going to become more of a matter of public debate. So, moral of the story here is that figuring out which standards we use goes a long way in telling us what kind of rules we have to make and enforce as a state. So we have to have some conceptual basis to get going with these groundwork. And that is precisely what we're going to be doing in this unit on social and political philosophy. We'll see right away with our first reading with John Stuart Mill that he's drawing a line in the sand and saying, you know what, the individual has rights and the state must respect them. And then we see an interesting counter-proposal by someone like Karl Marx, who says that our state really has been a necessary evil throughout time, and we need to look at the root cause and figure out if we can somehow see a resolution coming forward. Interestingly, there's one group here on this question of equality. There's this one group called egalitarians, political egalitarians. And we will see an example of someone who fits that model when we read John Rawls in this unit. Rawls is a political egalitarian, and the word égal just comes from French, by the way. It means equal. Égal in French is equal in English. So an egalitarian is someone who believes that people are at their core equal. So they take things pretty extremely. And what they're going to say is that from the individual's perspective, that things like how smart you are, how wealthy you are, how beautiful you are, how motivated you are. All that kind of stuff is really just luck. That there's a natural lottery that occurs. And we had no control over this natural lottery. So it would be inherently unjust of us to design a system of reward and punishment that's based on something that's out of our control. So egalitarians really have an interesting way of undermining those arguments based on merit in dealing with inequalities in society. So we have good stuff here in our third and final unit, and I hope you enjoy your readings.